1,500 years ago, in the west of Great Britain, we can find a reference to an extremely unusual event. A man named Serygei Withel is slain in battle by a local king who had apparently instructed his men to shackle themselves to their horses before the fight, so that they wouldn't think about fleeing. And while this is a bit odd on its own, what's weirder is that this story is the only mention of this battle in any contemporary source, and the only mention ever of this name, Serygei. Even stranger still is his epithet, Withel, which is Welsh for the Irishman. An Irish king, with a name never found anywhere else, who ruled, fought and died in Wales. Strange. Over the next millennia and a half, this story would be transformed and adapted, leading to arguments over who the men involved really were, where this battle really took place, or if it even really happened at all, until eventually, it was almost forgotten entirely. This is the mystery of Britain's Irish king. I am going to ask you to do a monstrous task. Remember two people. We've met the first one, Serygei, the Irishman. The second is his rival king, Cadwallon, nicknamed the Long Arm. According to a 14th century bard, he received this epithet because his arms could touch the ground when he was standing upright, which I'm not sure is true. Regardless, these men did apparently do battle, but the only medieval source ever mentioning this is a Welsh triad, a trio of short sentences designed to help a bard or poet's memory. Basically, they were summaries, grouped together with two other similar summaries. In this case, the men that fought in this battle were one of the three fettered or shackled or torqued war bands of Britain, and they apparently fought Serygei at a place known as Caergybi, the Irishman's Rocks, on the island of Ynys Môn. This place is most commonly thought to be here, a field with the same name, although both the rocks and the Irishman are no longer present. And that's it. We have a summary, two men, a place, and nothing more. And it's not unusual for these stories to be forgotten. Plenty, if not the majority, have been. But Cadwallon is a bit different, because he's claimed as one of the earliest ancestors to the kings of what would become the most powerful kingdom in Wales. You'd think that would give him a bit of credit, but they didn't care about Cadwallon. In the 9th century, a big piece of propaganda for this kingdom, Gwynedd, was produced. They gave themselves a new ancestor, an apparent and historically dubious grandfather for Cadwallon named Gwynedd, and he was better than his grandson in every way, because while Cadwallon might have defeated an Irish king on Ynys Môn, Gwynedd supposedly defeated and drove out the Irish from the entire country. Cadwallon was subsequently relegated to a name in a genealogy. His battle against an Irish king was deemed chronologically impossible, left out of the royal origin stories, and then completely forgotten by everyone. Sorry Cadwallon, maybe you should try being better next time. Except in one place. One place preserved the memory of Cadwallon and Serygei, but it wasn't some village near the site of the battle. In fact, it wasn't even on the same island. Instead, the people of Caergybi, Holyhead in English, had a much more unusual memory of these events. Near the very start of the 16th century, a Welsh poet named Ynys Mon included an odd passage in one of his works. He references this ancient battle between Cadwallon and the Irish, a piece of history that, as we've seen, hadn't been popular for over 700 years. One problem though, he doesn't mention Caergybi at all. Instead, he claims that the battle was fought near Caergybi. The historian Rachel Bromwich notes that Lewis was from this area, so what we're seeing here is very likely a local story, one that adopted a forgotten bit of history from centuries prior and moved it 1,931,208 centimeters north, or 12 miles. And by the end of the century, we would see this reinforced. In David Powell's History of Cambria from 1584, the following passage is included. The Irish did overrun the Isle of Mon, and were driven thence by Cadwallon Lawhir, who slew Serygei their king with his own hands at Llan which is the Irish church at Holyhead. So here we're introduced to another location, the Church of the Irishman, apparently the name of a church in Caergybi, and the new location of Cadwallon and Serygei's fateful battle. So these were both likely drawing on some sort of local legend, moving this battle from Ynys Môn to Caergybi, and specifically to a church named after the Irish. It was prominent enough to be featured in a book about the history of Wales, which is more consideration than it ever got from the Kings of Gwynedd, but unknown enough for no one to question the final battle being at the previously unmentioned Llan. And from here, the story would get picked up, by my count, 12 more times across the next 4 centuries, which is one mention on average every 33.3 years, the same amount that I mention my son that I hate. Now, if you've watched this channel before, you won't be surprised to learn that, whilst researching this topic, I got a little sidetracked asking how many times did this story come up, where did it come up, and how much did it change over the course of approximately 400 years. And after spending an entire day researching it, I might as well tell you all about it, otherwise this will all have been for nothing. Although, this is an important question. As I've said, the Kings of Gwynedd didn't care about this story at all. For the next 4 centuries, it was entirely left to the folklore of a town that wasn't even at the original battle site. Seeing how much Serygei's story changed can give us insight not only into the local legends, but it may provide some clues into this lost event. After 1584, the next time this story comes up is in an alleged account of Sir Richard Wynne, sometime in the 1600s, that closely agrees with the history of Cambria, only adding the detail that the Irish were destroyed completely. I could then find nothing for about a century until the historian Peter Bartrum brought up a letter from 1733, which mentioned the Bedd Serygin Withel as one of the marvels of Cubby. Now, Bedd means grave, which is a very interesting detail because now, Serygei seems to have just been defeated at Caergybi, but apparently he had a grave, and a famous one. But 42 years later is when we hit the real jackpot, a history of the island of Anglesey, which has a lot of new details, some of which are a bit questionable. We're first told that Cadwallon went to fight Serygei in the year 450, because these Irish had recently invaded Ynys Mon and slain numerous people near a strong fort called Dindrifol, at a place that was now known as Caergybi. Cadwallon defeated them and pushed them back to Caergybi where their fleet was docked, and he slew Serygei with his own hands. He then built a fortress, the walls currently around the church at Caergybi, which were apparently known as Mir Cadwallon, Cadwallon's Wall. The first detail that stands out is that the author of this text brings back Caergybi, but instead of the site of their battle, it seems to have commemorated a random slaughter near what he calls a strong fort, which is in reality a pile of rocks. Cadwallon's actual first battle location isn't named, but the final defeat is once again at the familiar Caergybi. One more oddity is that the author claims these walls around the church were built by Cadwallon, but in reality they're Roman. This was a Roman fort. Granted, the author probably didn't know this, but the extra detail of the walls being named after Cadwallon is very interesting. Unless they're mistaken, we can assume that it was again another local story, perhaps connecting our Cadwallon to this fortress. Although there's always the chance that it's named after someone else. The walls were restored in the 17th century. They could have picked up this name then. The second piece of intrigue that this author tells us are the alleged details of Serygei's grave. We've seen that this tradition already existed by 1733, but we're now given much more detail. Apparently, Serygei was buried in the south part of this Roman fort, and a chapel called Eglwys y Bedd, the Chapel of the Grave, was built on top of him. According to the author, this chapel was often known to the Welsh as Llan. Finally, he claims that Serygei was made a saint by the Irish, but that his shrine that used to be in the chapel was inconveniently carried off by Irish raiders, according to a Chronicle. What we've seen here then is an odd marrying of the original triad to the local folklore first brought up in the 1500s. Caergybi is the site of a defeat, but Cadwallon isn't said to have fought here. When he finally vanquished Serygei, it was at Caergybi in Llanagwyddel, which this author tells us is another name for this chapel of Eglwys y Bedd, finally locating this previously unspecified place. We have a few more texts in the 1800s. In 1824, we see this story again, although by now it's been acknowledged that the walls of Caergybi are Roman. But in 1832, we get a few more interesting details. In this History of the Island of Mona, the Latin name for Ynys Môn, Cadwallon for the first time since the original triad slays Serygei at Caergybi. Sort of. Because 152 pages later, we're back at Caergybi. The author cites a letter from 1693 claiming that the ancient name of this place was Llanagwyddel, and that the chapel of Eglwys y Bedd got its name because of all of the Welsh and Irish that died during Cadwallon and Serygei's final encounter, simultaneously claiming that Serygei died twice, at two separate locations. Two sources from 1854 and 1879 both compound the idea of Serygei being made a saint, with the first claiming that he was canonised by the Irish, and the latter by the Welsh. And strangely, a book from 1852 then again claims that Serygei was slain in two locations, Caergybi and Llanagwyddel, although they claim that Cadwallon founded this chapel himself after the victory. Finally, for this century, we have one more major lore drop. As we saw before, Cadwallon was deemed less cool and propagandistic than his historically dubious alleged grandfather Cynydda. And if Cynydda drove out all of the Irish, how could his grandson have defeated an Irish king? Well, the historian R. Rhys, in an essay on the Welsh saints in 1836, answers this question by saying that Cynydda just left Ynys Mon out, that the Irish retreated there, and that Cadwallon dealt the final blow. Wow. That was a lot of reading, and quite the workout for a guy like me who only learned how to read 2 weeks ago, but to summarise what we've seen. The Welsh triads tell us briefly of an ancient battle between King Cadwallon of Gwynedd and Serygei the Irishman. Cadwallon apparently defeated him at Caergybi on Ynys Mon, but unfortunately for him, by the 9th century, no one cared. However, by the 1500s, we find that the town of Caergybi, 12 miles to the north, did actually care, and that they adopted Cadwallon and Serygei's final battle, moving the location to the nearby Llanagwyddel. From the 1500s to the end of the 1800s, we're told that the local chapel of Eglwys y Bedd is the mystical Llanagwyddel, and that Serygei was buried underneath. We're told that he was canonised by the Irish, and maybe the Welsh too, but that his shrine was lost to Irish raiders at some point. We're finally told again that Serygei did die at Caergybi, but at the same time they claim he also died at Caergybi. It's a mess, really. It's what you'd expect from looking at 300 years of local stories and myths and unsubstantiated claims. It is worth acknowledging that these writers from centuries ago very likely had access to sources we don't have, but it's also worth noting that none of them have expanded on the details of the original triad. They seem to only have more information on the contemporary local legends. And while some of their claims seem reasonable, a lot of them, unfortunately, are completely unprovable, which we'll come to later. Finally, we come to the 20th century, where this story was scrutinised further, but also covered in a very important work, just before mentions of Serygei stopped almost entirely, as you can see from this almost comical graph. 1903, A Book of North Wales by S. Baring Gould. After reading so many texts inadvertently arguing with each other over whether Cadwallon won at Caergybi or at Caergybi, it was a massive relief to finally see something different, because Baring Gould claimed that this king won several battles at Irish strongholds across Ynys Mon before pushing them back to Caergybi, and the example he gives is a battle at Dinsiloi, over here, all the way to the east. Of course, by relieving, I mean massively confusing. I spent ages trying to find where else had this battle been mentioned or been called an Irish fortress, I couldn't find anything, and the reason for that will become clear in a few minutes. Moving on for now, the rest of the details are most of what we've seen already. Cadwallon slays Serygei by his own hand at Llanagwyddel, which was constructed on the spot that he died. Baron Gould calls the Welsh freaky for glorifying an enemy commander, compares this to the glorification of the Boers, and says that the walls of Caergybi are so uncouth that they cannot possibly have been Norman or Roman, so therefore must have been Welsh. That's a bit rude. And finally, he claims that this beautiful depiction on the church is of Serygei holding a short sword. Unfortunately, this isn't provable. It's not labelled as far as I'm aware. It could be him, although no one else has ever mentioned this, and I think he might be holding a trowel. Or at least, that's what I first thought. Because towards the end of my research, I found a book from 1913 that was quite critical of some of the elements of the local legend, particularly of those brought up in the history of the island of Anglesey. And they also claimed that this was a statue of Serygei. Aside from that, they question if Serygei was ever actually made a saint. There aren't any other references to him in Wales, and apparently the Irish don't ever mention him either. And in another blow, they point out that the author of the original claim that Serygei had a shrine that was carried off by Irish raiders never specifies where he got this information from, casting doubt on the entire idea of him being canonized. Their criticism of the 1775 source is great, but seeing another claim that this statue was Serygei caught me off guard because I wasn't expecting to find an actual depiction of him, let alone two claims of one. Until I noticed the author of the book, S. Baring Gould. Nice try. He almost got me, but in the end Mr. Baron Gould is still the only person to ever claim that this statue is Serygei. Finally, we come to the last text I want to mention, and the last major appearance Serygei and his story ever really made. The 1912 publication A History of Wales by John Edward Lloyd, a man nicknamed the Father of Welsh History. Lloyd's work is different to everything we've seen so far because this was a proper historical book with sources and citations and analysis rather than local stories with unsubstantiated claims. And of all the claims made over the centuries, Lloyd relays very, very few of them. He brings the story back to the original triad, one of the very few authors who did, by telling us that, according to tradition, Cadwallon completed the conquest of North Wales from the Irish, that he shackled his men to their horses so that victory and death were the only outcomes, and finally that he defeated Serygei at Caergybi, not Caergybi, sweeping away the evolving tale that we've just seen woven over the past 300 years. He does, however, reconcile one of the oldest details I mentioned, Llanagwyddel, an unspecified chapel near Caergybi that was eventually claimed as an alternate name for the local chapel of Eglwys y Bedd. Lloyd notes that in the parish of Tywyn, 55 miles to the south, there is a stone circle with the name Eglwys y Gwyddel, Chapel of the Irishman. He reasons that, if these stones can be known as an Irish chapel, who's to say that our Irishman's Rocks and Church of the Irishman aren't two names for the same place? The source he cites also makes a very unusual point that I'd never heard before. The author here claims that apparently it's quite common in Wales to name traces of ancient houses or walls after the Irish. And while that isn't very specific, I think I found what he was talking about, because while there are a few examples of medieval structures being named after the Gwyddel, the vast majority of the objects bearing their names are ancient. Cerygei, Caergybi, Craigagwyddel, Crigangwyddel, Tominagwyddel, Brynagwyddel, Bearthagwyddel, Eglwys y Gwyddelod, Eglwys y Gwyddelod 2, Miriar Gwyddelod, and Irish Joe's Cafe in Rhyl. Wait. All across Wales, we can find ancient monuments named after the Irish. Although looking at this map, I think you'll be able to see a very interesting pattern. There are only 2 in South Wales, 2 in Powys, 1 in Ceredigion, and 5 in Gwynedd. What's even more strange is that this isn't all of them, because there are 7 more that are not only named after the Irish, but that all have the same name, Cwtiau'r Gwyddelod, Irishman's Huts. And of these 7 Irishman's Huts, all of them are located in western Gwynedd, and 3 of them are in the vicinity of Caergybi. These huts are a series of roundhouses that are at least 2,500 years old. There are the remains of 20 to the west of the town today, but there could have once been as many as 50, not to mention the ones found to the south and the east. And these circular huts are the reason why Baron Gould thought that Dyn Syloi was an Irish fortress. Do you remember when I said we'd come back to that? Well, after I spent ages trying to find where he got this from, I eventually discovered that it was his own theory. He claimed that there are faint traces of these cutiae within the ancient fort, and despite the various Roman-era findings, he believes that it must date to the post-Roman Irish. You may not be surprised to learn that this isn't considered very historically accurate nowadays. There is apparently a circular structure inside, but the place was full of Roman artifacts and an Iron Age one, meaning that the fort was very likely built by the Britons, not the Irish, and that Cadwallon probably didn't besiege an Irish king here. But what we can say for certain is that there's a prevailing mythology across Wales, particularly in Western Gwynedd, that associates several ancient stone monuments with the Irish. And Caergybi, whatever these stones once were, is no exception. This isn't a story you can read about, it's one that I found accidentally while researching this topic and spending the day going through archaeological databases. But it is there, and it is especially dense around Caergybi, right where local tradition would claim Cadwallon slew Serygei, right where the Irish king of Ynys Môn was supposedly defeated and buried. Is this why these stories became connected? The Irish king dying in the town surrounded by the Irishmen's huts? Maybe. Or maybe not. We don't know, and to be honest, we can't know. The details, as we've seen, are extremely difficult to parse. The historian Rachel Bromwich points out the connection to these Irishmen's huts, but she also says that the location of Caergybi is a probable enough site for the battle. A historian in 1904 theorised that Serygei was a corrupted Norse name, and that this story must be from way later and just randomly connected to an otherwise unknown 5th century king. The modern historians Bartrum and Bromwich both disagree with this though, with the former stating that there probably is a historical basis for this story, and the latter suggesting that Serygei was instead some sort of corrupted Irish name, which would make sense, although as I said at the very start, this is the only time this name has ever occurred. We have no idea what the original Irish was. And it's no wonder that even the name of Cadwallon's opponent was forgotten, because as I've already said, none of the details of this story survive. In the minds of the 9th century kings of Gwynedd, Cadwallon's historically dubious grandfather did all of the work, driving out the Irish, giving Gwynedd a totally unbiased claim to the entire country, and leaving these people as nothing more than the apparent creators of these ancient monuments. This does, of course, disagree with a lot of historical evidence. Actually, any historical evidence. It's completely chronologically possible that Cadwallon fought an Irish king around the year 500, according to Bromwich, as inscribed stones have been found across Wales bearing Irish names that continued into the 6th century, both in Latin and in the Old Irish alphabet Ogham. In fact, according to the historian T. Charles Edwards, their presence on Ynys Mon is particularly noticeable, where we have 4 definite Irish inscribed names and no definite Welsh ones. The Irish were prominent in Wales, both here in Gwynedd and beyond, despite what their kings would have you believe. They left inscribed stones, they left place names, and in the south they even had an entire dynasty, so it's not at all out of the question that, at around the year 500, a Welsh king could have fought and defeated an Irish one on Ynys Mon. But that's all we can really know. That the Irish were here, and that the kings of Gwynedd soon made their home on this island for the next 700 years. Cadwallon apparently had his court here in northern Ynys Mon, and the chief court of the kings of Gwynedd would be here at Aberfraw to the south. Cadwallon's alleged son, King Maelgwn, also apparently possessed the Roman fort at Caergybi. His great-great-great-grandson was buried on this island, and his gravestone rests in a church that was rebuilt and named after his son, Cadwallon's alleged great-great-great-great-great-grandson. Gwyned's link to this island was also strengthened in their own 9th century propaganda, where Cynedda not only drove the Irish out of all of Wales, but his almost certainly mythical sons also founded numerous kingdoms in the area, covering what was at the time all of Gwynedd. giving them an ancestral claim to almost all of their lands, except for the territories known as Arfon and the island of Ynys Môn. Their hold was clearly strong enough here that they saw no need to fabricate some sort of ancient claim. So did Cadwallon conquer Ynys Môn from an Irish king? It seems so. At the very least, it's plausible. Was there a battle at Caergybi? Probably, but was it at this field? We don't know. There was a Caergybi on the eastern side of the island, and the original location easily also could have just been lost. By the 16th century, Cadwallon had also supposedly slain Serygei at Llanagwyddel in Caergybi, but we don't know where this came from. Is this a lost detail from the original story? Was it really just an alternate name for Caergybi? Bartrum points out that in a 13th century genealogy, this battle takes place at Llanagwyddel, Irishman's leap, and he suggests that Llanagwyddel was just a later mistake. If that's the case, then where's Llanagwyddel? Where did this detail come from? Was this a place near Caergybi, where the tale could have then been easily adopted by the locals? Or was Llanagwyddel really a local chapel, allowing the two names to easily conflate? We don't know. We can't know. In fact, we might never know. This is a story from 1,500 years ago. It's a miracle we know anything about it at all. All we can say then is that Cadwallon probably slew an Irish king named Serygei at a place called Caergybi somewhere on Ynys Môn. Were there more battles? Almost certainly. The existence of this triad proves that there was a story that needed to be remembered, but whatever that story was, has been forgotten. Maybe there was a final encounter at Caergybi, and while Serygei probably wasn't slain there, and while he almost certainly wasn't buried underneath a Gloiseberth, for a very long time, to a lot of people, this story was important, and that's worth something. Cadwallon's alleged son held this fortress. Who's to say that his father's final victory wasn't in the Roman walls of Caergybi? We don't know exactly what happened to King Cadwallon. The rulers of Gwynedd claimed him as their ancestor, and according to them, his successor was a man named Maelgwn, who they claimed was his son. But, as I've alluded to throughout the video, history can be a lot more complicated than that. In the mid-6th century, a monk wrote an angry sermon blaming the Britons' problems on their violent and tyrannical kings, which included Maelgwn, who the monk claimed had come to the throne at a young age by killing his mother's brother. Was Cadwallon really Maelgwn's father, or was he his uncle? Was Maelgwn's ancestry rewritten to include descent from a known figure, the man who conquered Ynys Môn, rather than whoever his real father was? Or was Maelgwn really his son? Did Cadwallon's unknown brother-in-law just rule upon his death until Maelgwn took the throne from him? We don't know. All we have on Cadwallon is essentially a blurb. The kings of Gwynedd were happy to claim descent from him, happy to claim that his potentially murderous nephew was really his son, and happy to rule from the island he conquered. But his story, his legend, wasn't good enough. Except for the people of Caergybi. These Roman walls contain a church today, dedicated to the eponymous Saint Cubi, who was given this fortress in the 6th century by King Maelgwn, Cadwallon's supposed son, at the site of his supposed victory. And in 1748, having gone disused for many years, a Gloiseberth was partially torn down. Thank you for watching.